All right. So, hello everyone. I am Yasin and welcome to today's Center for Education Neuroscience seminar. Before introducing our speaker, Professor James Booth, I want to share an exciting upcoming event. So, the International Mind, Brain and Education Societies Conference will be held in Belgium this July. This is an educational neuroscience conference designed for both educators and researchers. And many of us from the Center for Educational Neuroscience will attend. If you want to learn more about the conference, you can visit its website at imbas2024.org. I will write it to the chat as well. Now, without further delay, I just want to introduce Professor James Booth. So, James Booth is the Patricia Ann Rhodes Hart Professor of Educational Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology and Human Development at Vanderbilt University. And he is the director of the Brain Development Lab, where I had the great privilege of working with them in 2022. Professor Booth's current research centers on understanding the brain mechanisms involved in language, reading, and related cognitive processes in typical and atypical populations. He has received continuous federal funding for over 2 decades and has extensively published in diverse journals. He aims to foster interaction between the fields of development, cognition, and neuroscience, and apply this knowledge to improve children's lives. So in today's session, James will discuss the brain basis of language development. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat and I will address them at the end of the talk with James. So, James, over to you.
Thanks, Yasin. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great.
Yes.
So, yeah, very happy to be here. Some of you know I've occasionally attended when my schedule allows the Center for Educational Neuroscience lecture series. So this is great that you're doing this. I guess one positive effect of the pandemic, and you keep the torch burning, which is great. So I want to thank you, and I also want to thank the two host institutions, the University College London and Birkbeck University of London. And as Yasin mentioned, I'll highlight him here. He was a visiting scholar in my lab a while back, and it was great to have him. I'm very excited to learn more about his work on the teacher's understanding of neuro myths. So before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the grant support that I've received over the years. The work that I'm going to be talking to you today about is primarily funded by the National Institute of Deafness and other communication disorders. I'm going to highlight work from several graduate and postdoctoral students. This is actually all of them. So I'm not going to talk about all of their work, but I will highlight a few, and you're going to see their picture in the lower left-hand corner, and you'll also see their name as well. So just to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, they've been very important in all of the work that I have done. Some of you may know that our work focuses on developmental neuroimaging, pediatric neuroimaging. So we've scanned lots of kids over the years, and it's a huge time commitment for the families to be involved in this work. Once they find out about us and get into the lab, they have a lot of fun, but it is a huge time commitment. So I want to thank them as well. So this is an outline of what I'd like to talk about today. Why study language acquisition, and then move to neuro-cognitive models of development. And then the bulk of the talk is going to be talking about the phonological and semantic pathway and the semantic and morphosyntax pathway, and then wrap up with some future directions of what we're kind of doing now and what we plan to do in the future. So one reason to study developmental language disorder is because it's not widely acknowledged. Some people refer to it as the most common childhood condition you've never heard of. So parents and teachers know of dyslexia and ADHD. Those are kind of household terms, but they tend not to be familiar with developmental language disorder. This is similar to a lack of awareness about dyscalculia. So yeah, it's not widely acknowledged, but it is prevalent. There have been a variety of studies looking at the prevalence of developmental language disorder. This is kind of a listing of some of the studies here, and I just highlight two, which show. I'm just trying to get the control bar out of my screen. Okay. Which show that the prevalence is about 7% or so. Here you have language disorder of unknown origin, basically developmental language disorder. In the past, it was referred to as specific language impairment. Now we use a more general term. But anyway, the literature shows that, about 7 out of 100 kids are affected by developmental language disorder. So it's prevalent, and it's also of moderate severity. So this is an interesting paper that came out. It's actually a follow-on to Dorothy Bishop's paper decades ago, looking at the relationship between severity and how much research attention developmental disorders get. And you can see here that DLD, the previous name SLI, is of moderate severity compared to, kind of other neurodevelopmental disorders. And what this graph shows is that as disorders get more and more severe, there tends to be more research attention. There tends to be more publications on that disorder. So there's this correlation, and you see the confidence interval here. I've highlighted DLD and SLI, and you can see that it's outside of the confidence interval. So what does that mean? It means, like, given its severity, it doesn't receive much research attention. So clearly we need to do a lot more work kind of in this area. Another area that I'm quite interested in the future is speech sound disorder, and you can see that's even further out from the confidence interval. So why study language acquisition? Language disorders are common. They affect daily functioning of children if it breaks down. So yeah, a really important area of work. Next, I'm going to introduce to you some neuro-cognitive models of development that are kind of used to frame our neuro imaging work. The most common kind of model that we use to motivate our work is this interactive specialization model of brain development. This model essentially argues that the onset of a new behavioral ability is due to changes in the interaction between brain regions. And you can see that represented here, from little connection to more connections. So there are these changes as a function of development in terms of the specialization of brain regions, but also in terms of the interaction between brain regions. I think kind of the most interesting, I guess, hypothesis or assumption of this model is that these kind of early differences in connectivity or interaction result in the emergence, the later emergence of specialized regions in the brain. I'll come back to that idea in a bit, but most of our work has just looked at whether we can demonstrate specialization in kids and how this may change as a function of development. So we test the interactive specialization model in the context of the multiple pathways model proposed by, well, a lot of people, I suppose, but Frederici is a particular model that I'll use to motivate our work. And the idea is that you have, multiple pathways. Here you can see this kind of ventral pathway going from MTG to the inferior frontal, so the blue to the pink. That is involved in semantic processing. And then you have a dorsal pathway kind of going from the posterior superior temporal cortex to the dorsal inferior frontal gyrus. That is involved in a variety of things. We're going to talk about how it seems to be involved in phonological processing, but also how it's involved in processing syntax. So how it's involved in processing grammar versus how it's involved in processing the sound structure of words. So to simplify this model kind of even further, I'll just emphasize that, we look at this kind of ventral pathway involved in semantics or the meanings of words, and the dorsal pathway involved in processing phonology and syntax. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to several completed, in progress, and future studies. The first kind of study that I'll introduce to you is based on this large database that we have actually shared. So you can access this on Open Neuro. We've actually shared all of our data except for data that we're currently collecting. So we have about 10,000 scans or so of over about 1,000 participants that's shared on Open Neuro for anybody to have a look at. I'm plugging for that because surprisingly, it hasn't been used that much so far, but it's still, kind of the early days. So have a look if you're interested for sure. So we're going to focus on this neuroimaging project that looked at language processing in 5, 7, and 9-year-olds. This project had a bunch of different questions. As I said, we're going to focus just on whether we can demonstrate language specialization in young children and whether there appear to be developmental differences in that specialization. Other questions which we'll kind of touch upon briefly are listed here, so I'll come back to those later in the talk, but won't consider those in detail. So our first goal was to establish specialization in young children. The previous work was actually limited in terms of demonstrating specialization, focused on older kids. There was a large age range. I used a visual modality. It used just a single task. So, before our work, I argue that there's really no convincing demonstration of specialization in oral language processing in young children. So we set out to do that. First, what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at phonological versus semantic specialization. And we did so in the context of kind of single word auditory tasks. So a sound judgment task and a meaning judgment task. You can see the format kind of here. The sound judgment task, you just basically had to determine whether there was a shared sound between two words that were sequentially presented. Sometimes they shared the rhyme, sometimes they shared the onset, sometimes they were unrelated. There was also a perceptual control. There's also a meaning judgment task where you had to determine whether the two words kind of go together. And there were strong association items and weak association items, but also unrelated and perceptual controls. The data that I'm going to talk about today focused on just the yes responses, and I give you examples of those items here. So wide and ride, coat and cup, dog and cat, save, and keep. So as I said, these were auditorily presented sequentially, one after the other. Here you can see a rough indication of the time. There was about a 2 to 3 second response interval in which there was a yellow circle warning the child to respond. 5-year-olds could do this task pretty effectively. Here you can see the accuracy and the response times for this for these two tasks. You can see that accuracies were, 60 to 80%. The onset task was a little harder than the others, but overall, the kids could effectively do these tasks in the scanner. In terms of brain activation, both tasks activated kind of what you'd expect in terms of the language network. So there was a lot of bilateral temporal activation, a bit of parietal on the left activation, and some left inferior frontal activation. Mainly these overlap between the meaning and the sound task. You can see the overlap here in purple, although you do have an indication that there are some differences. And that was the goal of the study, right? To see whether there are differences between these tasks. So in other words, to demonstrate specialization. So this is a complicated slide, so I'm just going to step you kind of through it. So we have the sound task and the meaning task. For the sound task, so phonological processing, we contrasted the sound versus the meaning task. And you can see greater activation for the sound than the meaning task in red. You can also see that task difference was associated with skill. So the skill was actually a measure outside the scanner requiring phonological awareness. So in a lesion task where kids had to determine how you would say a word without a sound. So say tiger without the g, you'd say tire, right? So that's an lesion task. There was also a reliable difference between the onset and the rhyme. So onset showed greater than the rhyme. And you could look to see whether any of these contrasts overlapped. And in fact, all three of them kind of did overlap in the superior temporal gyrus. So all this data together suggested to us that, in fact, in 5-year-olds, there was this phonological kind of specialization in the superior temporal gyrus. In terms of semantic processing, we kind of did the reverse task contrast. So meaning greater than sound is indicated here in blue. Task by skill interaction is indicated in green. Remember, this is the task difference correlated with a skill measure. In this case, it was a word classes measure. Word classes basically are given kind of like 3 pictures, and you have to determine which 2 pictures are related in their meaning. And then we also look for weakly associated greater than strongly associated items. And that's represented in cyan here. Those contrasts didn't overlap much, but they were all proximal, kind of in this middle temporal gyrus area. So to us, this suggested that, in fact, yeah, in this age group, 5-year-olds, there was evidence also for semantic specialization. So we demonstrated specialization within the temporal cortex. You may be wondering, well, why didn't you find any specialization within the frontal cortex? Well, we didn't. Perhaps it's later developing. Perhaps we need more sensitive methods for kind of determining specialization in the frontal cortex. In fact, and kind of in an earlier review that our work was motivated on, is this kind of, it's a qualitative review of studies in kids looking at different tasks. And in fact, they reported that in this Brodmann's area 44, which is dorsal inferior frontal, seems to be more involved in phonology, where Brodmann's area 45 and 47, which is the ventral area of inferior frontal gyrus, tends to be more involved in semantics. But of course, this meta-analysis was mainly done in older kids, mainly didn't look at direct task comparisons, mainly used visual tasks. So yeah, I mean, of course, our goal was in younger kids with auditory tasks. And we've actually done some subsequent studies on this data in the 7-year-olds and in the 9-year-olds. And we've actually demonstrated specialization in the frontal cortex as well. So there seems to be like this shift from temporal specialization to frontal specialization as a function of development. I'm not going to talk about that data in detail here. I thought I'd just highlight a pre-registration that we have going on, and some preliminary analyses of that pre-registration, looking to see whether the home environment influences phonological and semantic specialization. So here we had a pre-registered study where we asked whether parent to child shared reading was related to the amount of specialization in 5 and 7-year-olds. This says just 7-year-olds, but we also have the parallel pre-registration for the 5-year-olds. And we found there was a relationship. So basically, the more shared reading, the greater the specialization, although it seems to depend upon age a little bit. So if you look at the 7-year-olds, more shared reading was associated with more semantic specialization. Here's meaning greater than sound related to amount of shared reading in kind of the middle temporal and inferior frontal. Low greater than high association was also related to amount of shared reading. In terms of the 5-year-olds, sound greater than meaning was associated with amount of shared reading in the superior temporal, and onset greater than rhyme was also related to amount of shared reading in the superior temporal. So this is actually the first demonstration that, kind of literacy practices in the home are associated with phonological and semantic specialization. And seems to suggest this kind of trajectory of kind of earlier phonological specialization and kind of later semantic specialization. I noticed that maybe Alicia Compton is in the audience from my lab. She's also playing a critical role in this project. So in summary, I think those were kind of the first studies showing phonological versus semantic specialization in young children. Our second goal was to look at semantic versus syntactic specialization in these young children as well. So these were sentence level tasks, and there was a semantic task and a syntax task. Here you can see the kind of the format that we used. There were strongly congruent and weakly congruent sentences. Requiring a yes response. There was also incongruent responses requiring a no response, and then a perceptual control. That's for the semantic task. For the syntax task, we had grammatical items, and then we also had some kind of violations of syntax, so a finiteness violation and a plurality violation, and then also a perceptual control. Today, I'm just going to focus on the yes responses, because some people argue that yes responses are kind of more reflective of natural language processing. So we'll just consider those in this talk today, although we have other work looking at the no responses. Examples of these sentences for the semantic task are things like, last week she baked 2 cakes. For the syntax task, an example is something along the lines of, every day they play 1 game. So these were auditorily presented, and they listened to the sentence in about 3 to 4 or so seconds. And then there was a 3 to 4 second response interval. And again, during this response interval, there was a yellow dot that appeared, encouraging the child to make a response. So in the semantic task, they had to determine whether it makes sense. In the syntax task, they had to determine whether it sounds right. The kids could do these tasks pretty effectively. So you can see here the accuracy and the reaction time for these different tasks. You can see that accuracy ranged from about 60 to 80%. The grammaticality task was a little more difficult than the semantic plausibility task, but overall, 5-year-olds could effectively do these tasks. In terms of activation, there was kind of like bilateral activation in the lateral temporal cortex involving the superior temporal, but also the middle temporal. You can see here, there's not evidence, at least over the whole group, for inferior frontal activation, which was a little bit surprising to us. It could be that there are just big individual differences in frontal activation. Yeah, I'll come back to that issue, in a little bit. So in order to examine specialization, we use kind of multi-voxel pattern analysis. Some of you may not be familiar with this approach, so I'll briefly kind of go through it for you. So essentially what you do is you extract some number of voxels. In our case, we extracted 250 voxels from regions of interest. And then what you do is you kind of correlate the pattern of activation in those voxels within a task or between tasks. So here's an example of within syntactic correlations. You can see here that this pattern is similar to this pattern, so they're correlated. Here you can see this pattern for the syntax task is quite different than the pattern for the semantic task, right? So these two patterns are not correlated. So the across-task correlations are low. You can also look at the within semantic correlations, right? So this pattern is similar to this pattern. So these are high correlations. So basically the idea is that if you have kind of within syntactic correlations, say between run 1 and run 2, that are larger than across task correlations, that is an indication of specialization. So that's the approach we looked at to look at specialization. And there are different kind of levels of evidence, I suppose, in terms of the amount of specialization. You can have strong and weak evidence. So strong evidence would be along these lines. So you have greater correlations within a task. So within the grammatical, right? And that's greater than across, but it's also greater than within semantic correlations, right? So this would be strong evidence. Weak evidence would be, yeah, we have stronger evidence within the grammatical. It's stronger than across, but it's not really different from the within semantic, right? So that would be weaker. You can think about the same for the semantic specialization. In a sense, that would just be like kind of a mirror of the syntax. Regions could be sensitive to both. So you have basically greater within semantic, greater within grammatical as compared to the cross, but there's no real difference between these two. So that would mean that they're sensitive to processing both semantics and syntax, or it could be sensitive to neither, right? So there's no difference between the within and the across. So we use this approach to look at whether there was specialization, and these were pre-registered studies. So we looked at whether there was specialization for semantics in the middle temporal gyrus, and we see some evidence here that there is. So the within semantic was greater than the across, although the within semantic wasn't really greater than the within syntax. So it's kind of weak evidence for the semantic specialization. In terms of the superior temporal gyrus, we showed that the within semantic was greater than the across, but grammatical, so within syntax, was also greater than across, and there was no difference between the two. So this really indicates that the superior temporal cortex is kind of sensitive to both semantic and syntactic, so perhaps an integration site. We didn't demonstrate any specialization in frontal cortex in this group of 5-year-olds. So you can see here that there's kind of no differences between the within versus across task correlations. So in the lateral temporal cortex, we see some evidence for semantic specialization in the middle temporal. We see some evidence for integration in superior temporal. I didn't mention this, but this is actually broadly consistent with the Frederici model. The Frederici model argues that the middle temporal, is more of a semantic region, whereas the superior temporal that projects dorsally into the frontal cortex is more a integration region. So it's roughly actually consistent with that model. We didn't show any specialization in older kids, but we do have some subsequent studies, pre-registered studies in the 7 and the 9-year-olds, suggesting, in fact, that there is some specialization in those older age groups. So again, this idea of this kind of temporal to frontal shift in terms of specialization over development. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the other aims of this project and not talk about them in detail. You may remember that there were 4 other kind of aims. One was, does connectivity drive specialization? The other one was, is early specialization related to later achievement? In terms of the first question, whether connectivity drives later specialization, we have a pre-registration that we're currently pursuing. And the basic idea here is that, maybe connectivity within the dorsal pathway will be related to later specialization for grammatical processing in that pathway, and maybe connectivity in the ventral pathway will be associated with later specialization for semantic processing in that pathway. And we can also look at phonological versus semantic as well. So dorsal for phonological and semantic for ventral. So we're currently pursuing that idea, but we don't have data at this point. We do have some data looking at whether early specialization is related to later achievement. So this is data that we pre-registered looking at phonological versus semantic specialization. So as you'd expect for the sound task, we see evidence for phonological specialization in the superior temporal. We see evidence for semantic specialization in the middle temporal, but the real goal was to see whether these early differences in specialization predict later achievement. And in fact, we did show that phonological specialization predicts reading growth from 6 to 7-year-olds. So here you can see a plot of phonological specialization in the superior temporal as a function of reading growth from time 1 to time 2. So we do have some evidence that, we can predict later achievement. We didn't see semantic specialization predicting later achievement. So now we're following up with some subsequent studies in the older population with the idea that maybe in the older groups, you'll see semantic specialization predicting later reading achievement. 2 of the other questions in this project was to look at whether low language ability or developmental language disorder was associated with lack of specialization, and whether these folks had the decoupling of the interactive specialization process. I've already actually showed you evidence for this lack of specialization and low language ability. Remember, that was the first study where we showed phonological awareness was correlated with amount of phonological specialization, whereas vocabulary was associated with lack of semantic specialization, right? So most of our work looking at kind of individual differences in language ability have been using the whole sample as a continuous distribution. We haven't yet looked at the decoupling of interactive specialization and these in these low language groups, so we're certainly kind of interested in doing that. Surprisingly, there's very little information that we know about the neural correlates of developmental language disorder. This is a review that's getting a little old now, but it's from 2015, and You can read the conclusions here, but I mean, the basic conclusion is, like maybe there's some differences in the amount of hemispheric lateralization. So, we don't really understand much about developmental language disorder or low language ability. This is probably the largest study to date that has looked at individual differences in language and its relationship to the neural correlates during verb generation. They actually looked to see whether there was a difference between DLD, developmental language disorder, and controls, but didn't find one. So they treated language as a continuous variable, and they did see some associations. This is also a pre-registered study, but they used verb generation, as I said, and they showed that, better performance on verb generation was associated with greater activation of the inferior parietal, but also this inferior frontal. So yeah, there are very few studies looking at developmental language disorder, but they seem to converge on, maybe there's some differences in terms of hemispheric lateralization. Maybe there's less robust engagement of the left hemisphere kind of core nodes of the language network for processing language. Okay, so that gives you like a sampling of the work we've done over the last few years. Looks like we still have 20 minutes, right, Yasin?
Yes, James. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd just be 10 more minutes, so we should have plenty of time for a question. I just want to give you like a sampling of some of the things that we're doing now. Yasin was asking about this project, how it's going. Well, we're still collecting data. Recruitment is a challenge, of course, for a lot of people. So we're looking at so we're looking at just to back up a little bit, in children who are deaf and hard of hearing, a lot of these kids tend to struggle with learning to read, although there are huge individual differences. So some kids are really great readers. So the basic question was, is higher reading skill in deaf and hard of hearing kids associated with different pathways depending upon their communication background. So we gave kind of localizers, or we are giving localizers to these kids, kind of localizing phonology and semantics, and then we want to see how those regions are engaged in reading tasks. And the kind of basic idea is that maybe the predominantly oral kids are going to be those who are higher skill are going to be engaging this dorsal pathway because they're taking advantage of the alphabetic principle, the systematic or the relatively systematic mapping between letters and their sounds. Whereas a predominantly sign, those who are higher skill are going to more engage this ventral pathway. And the idea here is they're engaging that ventral pathway because they're directly mapping between kind of whole word spellings and their meanings. Also involved in some collaborative work with Yulia Kovalman at University of Michigan, where we're looking at whether the nature of the writing system results in kind of different manifestations of dyslexia. So this is a comparison of English versus Chinese. We've done a lot of work actually looking at cross-linguistic differences, showing that the English readers tend to engage more of the dorsal pathway. And the idea again here is because there's this relatively systematic mapping between letters and their sounds, whereas Chinese tends to engage more of the ventral pathway. And the idea here is that's because Chinese is more of a logosyllabic system, mapping kind of syllables to meaning. So they don't have the alphabetic principle. So perhaps they rely kind of more on this ventral pathway. So the basic hypothesis is that, perhaps dyslexia in English will be more associated with alterations of this dorsal pathway, whereas dyslexia in Chinese will be more associated with alterations in the ventral pathway. I'm also collaborating with Yulia on a project looking at developmental language disorder. And here we're kind of extending our work on specialization for semantics versus syntax at the sentence level. So we've done a bit of work in English for sure. I've shared some of that with you today, but we've also done some work looking at specialization in Spanish-English bilinguals, showing similar, effects in that group. So the basic idea is that those who are low language or developmental language disorder, if they're lower proficiency, they're going to show less cortical specificity, so less specialization. But the central idea of the grant is, maybe this dual language use will be a protective factor. So greater dual language use in this population of DLD may result in greater cortical specificity, so greater specialization for these different pathways. A project that we're just starting up now, and I think maybe Marline is here, I think, yeah. And the audience is looking at late talkers. Yeah, some of you who have followed the work on late talkers, this work has been going on for decades, but we're still not very good at predicting kind of the developmental trajectories in these kids. So some kids who are late talking are late bloomers, so they kind of catch up. Other kids who are late talkers are kind of persistently behind. And behavior is kind of modest at being able to predict these trajectories. So kind of our idea is to supplement the behavioral measures with neuroimaging measures. So to study 3.5 to 4.5 year olds, and have behavioral as well as neuroimaging measures to see if we can kind of better predict these developmental trajectories. So again, we're going to be kind of looking at this dorsal pathway involved in phonology using picture-based tasks. So tasks like snake and cake, a rhyming task, and we're also going to be looking at this ventral pathway involved in semantics. An association task like so you see two pictures of related objects such as spoon and fork. So we have some specific predictions about how this may unfold over time, but the overall goal is to see whether we can use these neural measures to help us predict these outcomes in these kids who are kind of late talking. An area that I've only done like a little bit of collaborative work with some kind of colleagues in China, or in Taiwan, looking at autism. Autism is an interesting contrast, I suppose, with kind of developmental language disorder, and I've begun to think a little bit about what some of the differences kind of may be. It's very interesting in autism. There tends to be like over or hyperconnectivity within the language network and reduced connectivity of the language network with other networks. That may be a reflection of their kind of social communication deficits, but it seems to be kind of opposite actually for developmental language disorder. So developmental language disorder seems to be characterized by reduced connectivity within the language network, perhaps reflecting their core language issue, and actually enhanced connectivity of the language network with other networks, perhaps suggesting some kind of like compensation. So we're kind of like toying with the idea of thinking about how we could look at this kind of dorsal versus ventral pathway in these two groups. So just to wrap up, developmental disorders of language are common, but we lack an understanding of their neurocognitive basis. The interactive specialization model I think is useful for studying language acquisition. Most of what I presented to you today is a kind of a demonstration of a semantic versus phonological specialization and syntactic versus semantic specialization. Early on, it seems to predominantly characterize temporal regions, but kind of later on, perhaps because the frontal cortex is slower to mature, we see specialization in that area. I think the interactive specialization approach is useful for thinking about different forms of neurodiversity. This could be due to constitutional factors or environmental factors. So constitutional factors could be, like developmental language disorder, or environmental factors could be things like, shared book reading, which I briefly talked about. So I'd just like to end and thank everybody for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Superb. Thank you, James, for this fascinating talk. Really, really interesting results, actually. And we will have some questions, but before I go to audience questions, I want to ask a very general question just to start. So, James, you talked about the relationship between engagement of phonological and semantic pathways and reading skills for 5 to 9 years children. So, were they all typically developing, or any of the participants included deaf and hard of hearing children for this study?
Yeah, I mean, so there was a range of kids. We were pretty kind of lenient in terms of our inclusionary criteria, because we really wanted to look at the kind of the whole range of language skill. So our criteria for these studies was greater than an 80 scaled score on kind of an overall language measure, such as the core language on the self. We have just a small number of kids who score lower than that. So yeah, I'd say more or less in the typical range. Yeah, and none of the data that I presented to you today includes kids who are deaf and hard of hearing.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. So we have a question from Chloe Marshall. She says, a rich and fascinating James, thank you. And she wonders how far the findings you presented in part 3 of your talk with respect to phonology are affected by children acquiring and mastering code-based literacy skills between the ages of 5 and 9. If that was a really long one, it's also in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, so basically the question is, are there bidirectional relationships? So does, individual differences in phonological awareness determine later reading skill, or does the mastery of the written word, so reading acquisition, influence later phonological awareness? So I have to give a shout out to Jin Wang, who actually, for her dissertation, she really tried to kind of unpack that relationship. So she focused just on the phonological awareness measure, and then she looked at reading skill, and she looked at 5, 7, and 9-year-olds. And it's a complex pattern of results that she has developed over the course of, I think, 3 or 4 papers. But I guess the 30,000-foot summary is that there are bidirectional relationships. So certainly, learning to read seems to result in greater ability to manipulate the sound structure of language, particularly for these smaller grain sizes. So particularly for the onsets. So she has this nice paper that just came out, I think, in Journal of Speech, Hearing, and Language Research, where she looked at whether reading skill, I think a 7 predicts kind of connectivity at 9. But basically what she reported was that reading skill earlier predicted connectivity between the SDG and the fusiform later. So SDG involved in phonological processing, and the fusiform involved in visual word processing. So her basic argument was like, yeah, reading skill essentially, yeah, determines this connectivity between orthography and phonology, and that's what changes kind of the nature of phonological processing. So yeah, bidirectional relationship. Great question.
Thank you, James. And we have two more questions from Michael Thomas. Would you like me to read it to you, or it's because it's a long one, I don't want to,
Yeah. So two questions. So with respect to the brain specialization, there's not much of a syntax story here. Is syntax subsumed within semantics and phonology at the brain level? Does that have any implication for therapeutic intervention in grammatical deficit? Any sense whether individual differences in emergent specialization for language are intrinsic versus environmentally driven? There's a lot there. uh, so yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to address all of it, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of controversy actually kind of over, whether you can actually demonstrate, specialization for syntax versus semantics. I mean, we're pretty neutral in our theoretical, approach. We don't really have an axe to grind either way. But certainly some people are grinding the axe like, oh yeah, there's definitely specialization for, syntax versus semantics. Other people are saying, well, no, basically syntax is semantics. There's no specialization. So yeah, yeah, I think our data, suggests that if there is specialization, it's going to be weak and maybe later emerging. So I guess that relates to, your kind of your question there in terms of whether it's intrinsic or environmentally driven. Maybe since it's emerging over time, maybe it's more environmentally driven. Yeah, there's also an interesting thing in terms of whether there are skill-based kind of differences in the interaction between semantics and syntax, and we've been thinking about that a while. I think Marline is maybe in the audience. But anyway, our follow-up study is going to look at just the grammatical task, and we're going to use localizers. We're going to use phonology, and we're going to use semantic localizers to independently identify areas involved in those processes. Okay, so we're going to identify those with the localizers at the word level, right? And then we're going to look at how those areas are engaged when making grammatical judgments. So the idea is like those who are higher skill, are they like engaging more phonology, or are they engaging more semantics? Because there's some indication like those who are kind of lower skill, maybe they're bad at making these segmentation of the morphological inflections, right? So maybe they're bad at phonological processing. Whereas there's also some indication those who are lower skill, maybe they are using semantics as a compensatory mechanism. So they're relying more on semantics and less on their parsing mechanism. So we're trying to get at those issues a bit with some of our kind of follow-up studies, because certainly when you process sentences, there's a lot going on. But we think that maybe our approach will allow us to get some like leverage in terms of what the underlying mechanisms involved are.
Great. Thank you, James. I hope that, yeah, okay. We have a question from Mahi. She asks, were there more individual differences in language sensitive regions among the younger children due to their age?
Among the younger children,
Yes. Due to,
yeah. So yeah, generally we our analyses, even though we have a tight age range, we partial for age in looking at our effects. So our age range in the 5-year-olds is roughly maybe like more or less 5.5 to 6.5. So we don't have a large range. So we can't really look so much at age effects within an age. Of course, our late talker project, we're going to also have a typical group. And there we'll be studying, 3.5 to 4.5, and then following them again when they're 5.5 to 6.5. So maybe we'll get a better sense of these kind of, early changes as a function of age in the preschool range.
Okay. Actually, just another question from me. So, James, you're testing the interactive specialization theory, and so far you've found supporting evidence, also some challenging evidence as well. But how do you think, very general, sorry, how do you think these findings could inform educational interventions, for instance?
So we actually have very little support. So the interactive specialization model argues that, there are developmental changes in interaction. There are also developmental changes in specialization. But I think the core assumption that these, early differences in interaction result in later differences in specialization, there's very little support for that assertion. So we don't really have a lot of core convincing kind of support for that. I think the shared parent to adult to child reading data is quite relevant. To kind of educational implications, showing that greater shared reading, you have more phonological specialization in the younger kids, more semantic specialization in the older kids. I'd also like to see whether that's related to grammatical versus semantic specialization. We haven't done that yet. That'd be an interesting project to do. But the educational implications of that is maybe shared book reading early on should be more code-based. Whereas later on, maybe the shared book reading should be more meaning-based, right? Because it seems as though the shared book reading is resulting in this phonological specialization earlier, whereas the semantic specialization later. In terms of semantics versus syntax, I'm not sure, but it's probably going to be even later, right? So maybe maybe the shared book reading is going to be associated with, I don't know, a semantic versus syntax difference in the 9-year-old, so the oldest age group that we have. So maybe that would suggest that, when you do shared reading later with kids, maybe engage them more in complex, nested, hierarchical, syntactic structures.
Great. So we will have just one last question because we are running out of time. So Frederick asks, could you comment on hemispheric functional asymmetry for semantic and phonological processing in young children?
Yeah, not so much. We're, I guess, guilty by lopping off the right hemisphere. Sorry for those who like the right hemisphere. We do too. We also like the cerebellum, but we tend to lop that off too. So I guess the general conclusion is that phonological processing, at least with the tasks that we use, tend to be more left hemisphere lateralized, whereas semantic processing tends to be more kind of bilateral. So in terms of developmental differences in those two effects, I don't know, because we really haven't looked at it in our data, and I'm not really familiar with the data at large. It is interesting, though, to think that for example, in autism, I briefly referred to that kind of earlier. So those folks, those who are autistic, tend to have relative strengths in phonological processing, but relative weaknesses in semantic processing. And that seems to be paired actually with the pattern of brain differences you see. So in this group, they tend to have hyper connectivity within the language network in the left hemisphere, but reduced connectivity of the left and the right hemisphere. So that could be like a correlate of the overall effect that you see in terms of their behavioral performance with relative strengths in phonology and relative weaknesses in semantics. So it'd be interesting to look at these skill-based effects and how they, how they change as a function of age.
Superb. James, thank you very much for your talk. Before we end, some of the audience asked actually whether you would be able to share some of your slides. Maybe I will share my email and they can send me an email, then we can get in touch with you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share those slides for sure. So yeah, thanks so much for having me and thanks for the great questions. I don't think I got all the questions, but I did my best.
We got some more burning questions possibly, but we are running out of time. James, thank you so much for your time and thank you for your questions, dear audience, and see you in the next CEN seminar next Thursday. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.